the thing about identity politics is I'm actually not a complete critic of identity politics. And Mark Lilla, a friend of mine and colleague, came to Wellesley, and we had a conversation on stage, and he was criticizing identity politics, and I was giving him a little bit of a pushback. I said, well, wait a minute, I have Irish immigrant ancestors, and my grandmother was an Italian immigrant back in the early 20th century. And when those Irish relatives of mine mobilized for their interests, they mobilized as Irish. When my Italian relatives organized to promote their interests, they organized as Italians. So it was identity politics. I mean, the mafia was one of the great first identity politics organizations. That's right. They were Italians. They were very clear. They were Italians, and this is what we want. So I said, now you're coming, and I was giving him a hard time. I said, you're coming and you're saying that identity politics is dead. Now that, I say, African Americans and Asian Americans have discovered identity politics. And a lot of groups, you're saying it's no longer viable. I said, it is viable, but it has to be done in a way that's
responsible, actually.
That's responsible. And, of course, it's difficult for, a person like me, a white male, privileged person, to tell people in different identity groups how they should do their politics. I mean, I'm very sensitive about that. But one thing I do know as a sociologist, and as I try to look at this objectively, is that identity politics is almost always based on a fundamental story of victimization. That this is our group and we've been victimized in this way or marginalized in this way. And normally there's a case to be made. For instance, Asian Americans can point to the history of treatment of Asian Americans in the United States and say, look how they treated us. It was terrible, and it was. You have to acknowledge that historically. So there is some sense in which marginalized groups, identity politics groups there's truth to the stories, but what happens is that the victimization element of it takes precedence over other elements of it.
Well, Jordan Haidt said about a common enemy.
Yes, and it becomes enemy politics. I mean, I'm a victim of this, and you did this to me, and it becomes divisive. But the real problem is when the victimization, and this gets back to the idea of emotional capitalism, when the victimization is used tactically, emotionally, to advance a group's interests rather than to really seek social justice or justice of some kind.